The state's Postal Service recently announced what it's calling refinements to service standards. Phase 1 got underway Tuesday. The Postal Service says while most mail delivery will be unchanged, some may have a faster standard and others may have a slightly lower standard. Those changes are projected to save at least $36 billion over 10 years. The president of the Bangor Area American Postal Workers Union, Robert Paraki, stopped by our studio today to talk about the current state of the Postal Service. Paraki says he supports the goal of bringing the Postal Service into financial profitability. However, he says privatization, as previously suggested by President Trump and Doge head Elon Musk, is not the solution. Instead, he would like to see the Postal Service offer more to customers, such as basic banking, census work, electric vehicle charging, and even hunting and fishing licensing. Last month, he participated in this informal picket in Bangor, which was part of a national day of action against the privatization of the USPS.
Basically, privatization is going to be selling off the Postal Service to corporations, and it'll become a for-profit instead of a public service. Obviously, anything that isn't profitable will probably go away. They could reduce delivery service to say 3 or 5 days a week. They could also turn it into a subscription that you have to pay if you want mail delivered. And obviously, a lot of the smaller post offices will close down.
He encourages anyone who is against privatization to reach out to their elected representatives.